It is with an odd mixture of misgiving, inspiration, and excitement that I've decided to publish this book based on a diary I kept in Colorado in 1970. Misgiving because the concepts presented in it raise issues likely to create some shockwaves in the already churning oceans of religious, philosophical, and scientific thought. It's necessary to your comprehension of these shockwaves that you understand at the outset why this book was written. The explanation will also allow me to shift part of the blame or the credit, quote, whichever word applies, for the far-out subjects of the text, since in reality I had little control over the channeling of the material. I've always written my books in such a way as to share many of my personal feelings and experiences with you, my readers, because I trust you, and I'm still following that pattern of taking you into my confidence. It makes me feel closer to you, as it makes you feel closer to me, which so many of you have told me in your letters. And so, this is how it all came about. Once upon a lonely time, when I was in California on a promotional tour for my first book, Sun Signs, staying in the haunted suite 1217 of the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel, a stranger knocked on my door. The year was 1970, the month January, New Year's Day. Several years earlier, while I was talking with Lucille and David Kahn in New York, my home at the time, we had drifted into a discussion about masters, avatars, space people, gurus, and adepti. David Kahn, since deceased, was the mentor of the well-known and beloved mystic Edgar Cayce, who encouraged Cayce's work and provided his living expenses during the early years. For the longest time, I had been mesmerized by the ancient Tibetan adage of, "When the student is ready, the teacher will appear." And so I asked David a question. What precisely, I wanted to know, does that mean? How does such a teacher appear? Does he just knock on the door some unexpected day or night, and when you answer, there he is? David and Lucille glanced at each other with a mysterious smile. Then David turned to me and replied quietly, "Well, yes, something like that." Now we can return to once upon a time a few years later in Suite 1217 at the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel on January 1st, 1970. When I answered the stranger's knock, I saw standing there in the open doorway a plump man, shaped rather like a Buddha, wearing the incongruous combination of a proper business suit, suede loafers, and a snow-white turban fastened in the center with a pearl stick pin. He had an irresistible, almost childlike smile and an impeccably gracious manner. I soon learned he was an initiated Hatha Yoga and a Zen Buddhist who had spent 30 years in a monastery in India under a vow of silence. I had never heard of anyone being both a Hatha Yoga and Buddhist, but then I was still very much a novice in such matters. His complexion was creamy olive, his eyes not brown but black and piercing. He apologized for the intrusion, saying that he had read my first book, Sun Signs, and some of the passages in it caused him to perceive that I was already aware of many mystical secrets, but was still questioning the more star signs of truth. And he felt that perhaps he might be able, in some small way, to guide me along the path of light. His voice had mystical intonations, with a pronounced British accent. Later he told me he had been educated at Oxford and had lived for some time in London. He offered no explanation of how he had managed to locate me, and I didn't ask, feeling that such a direct question was forbidden by some esoteric rule of conduct. I didn't know this, but I sensed it. Of course, I invited him to come in, curious yet not alarmed. For the next several hours, we chatted like old friends, although there seemed to be a strange pattern to our talking. I had the impression that our speech was, in an inexplicable way, speeded up, because our words were exchanged so swiftly, almost without pause, sentences tumbling over one another, and at times I could have sworn we were speaking simultaneously, like a double track on a tape. I had 1,001 questions for him, and each was answered no less than profoundly. Excited and exhilarated as I was to be learning so much in such a brief time, I felt a surge of regret when he told me he would soon have to leave because he was late for an appointment at the Griffith Park Observatory. But before we part, he added, I have a message to relay to you from the masters of karma, channeled through me by the higher forces. Oddly, such an unusual statement neither alarmed nor surprised me, but it certainly fascinated me. Message? What kind of message? I asked. About your future. There are some events ahead in time, even an astrologer as experienced as yourself cannot fully penetrate, because they lie above and beyond the natal and progressed planetary configurations. And what then is ahead in time for me? Involuntarily, my pulse quickened, and I felt a sudden chill. He spoke slowly and very deliberately. Soon you will be going to the mountains. The mountains? Do you mean Tibet? The Alps? Switzerland, maybe? I've always wanted to go there. He smiled enigmatically, and his reply was noncommittal. To a higher altitude, for the purpose of raising your vibratory frequency and receiving several gifts of illumination from teachers who will appear without your seeking them. Without my seeking? Is that not how I came to you this day? Yes, of course. Is it related then to the ancient Tibetan adage I've heard that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear? Quite. I was later to learn that was his favorite word of approval. Well, it all sounds rather spooky. I smiled to show him I was joking, but I was only half joking. There was an unreal sensation about this conversation. His next words were completely unexpected and shocking. After your retreat in the mountains, you will travel back here to California, where you will meet your twin self. Twin self? Don't you mean twin soul? No. There is an important difference in the definition of the two terms, as you will soon learn for the purpose of teaching others. Are you saying that I'll learn this difference while I'm in the mountains from the teacher I'll meet there without my seeking? Partially. But you will be fully enlightened to this only after you have met the man who is the other half of yourself. Following your meeting, you will write a book about everything you will teach one another. However, you must not make it available to your readers until after you have written and published a book you will also write about your experiences of enlightenment in the mountains, which will occur in Earth time before you meet this man. He waited, but I made no comment. Then he continued, After you've met, it will become clear to both of you that your mutual mission, as written in the Akashic records, is manifold. You are to make others aware that such phenomena as magical cognition, the seeing of auras, the power to ordain happiness and erase misery, the ability to attain spontaneous remission of illness, and the achievement of immortality, do not belong exclusively only to a few masters, but are possessed by all earthlings and may be developed to as high a degree as they desire. Again he waited, and again I remained silent, not wanting to express my reaction to these words aloud, as I thought to myself that there was no way I could ever be capable of meeting such a challenge as he presented, with or without the other half of myself. He might as well have told me that the following day I would be able to manifest a spacecraft out of the ethers, hop in, press a button, and zoom off for a weekend on Mars or Saturn. The manifold mutual mission he described was so unattainable as to be amusing if it hadn't been so overwhelming. My silence didn't seem to disturb him. His enigmatic smile remained, and his eyes continued to burn into mine like a laser beam. After a moment or so, when it became obvious that I was not going to respond, he simply went on with his incredible statements. An important part of the illuminations the two of you will seed into the sleeping awareness of humans is the importance of love to men and women, and the various paths they may take toward a reunion with the twin self. He paused, and his voice took on a sterner tone, making his next words sound like a warning. And the danger, once the other half has been found, of both becoming what have been called fallen angels, destroying their sacred, for eons awaited oneness through the grave sins of false pride, selfishness, and unforgiveness. It is further written in the Akashic records that this too is part of the mission you and another assigned yourselves long ago, to be accomplished in this present incarnation. The task will be extremely difficult, but you must not allow yourselves to be discouraged. You must also be aware that, if you should fail in your mutual mission, there are others, not only others who will be simultaneously teaching the same truths, but others who will replace you should you give up. For the teaching itself is the priority, and it shall not be allowed to fail. Earth time is growing short, so short that the approaching moment of human choice between enlightenment and extinction must now be measured by the year instead of by the century. Another pause from him, another silence from me. Your task will require much courage because you will face disbelief and ridicule. You will also face the challenge of many false teachings contradictory to your own, which are even now swiftly spreading throughout the world. For these are the days of the false prophets predicted by John in Revelations in your Christian scriptures. My mind contained, superimposed, two thoughts. The first was a surge of thankfulness that, at some time during our conversation, I had asked him if he minded my turning on my small tape recorder so that I could later recall at least a portion of what he was telling me, because I knew I was likely to forget much of it or believe I had dreamed the entire incident. And he had agreed. But as I glanced down, I saw that the tape had run out. I had no idea when. Then, glancing at the clock on the table, I saw that barely a minute or so had passed since I turned on the 90-minute tape. And I knew positively that the things he had been saying, which were naturally still clear in my memory, could not possibly have taken such a brief time as a minute or so. It puzzled me, but more it frightened me, in the sense that all things not completely understood are frightening when they occur. The second superimposed thought was that his words had made such a profound impression on me, I didn't trust myself to comment. Especially his statement that Earth time is growing so short that the approaching moment of human choice between enlightenment and extinction must now be measured by the year instead of by the century. Consequently, until I had a chance to assess all of this within, I knew I had to change the subject in self-defense. So I did. Clearing my throat nervously, I finally spoke. Forgive me, but I've always believed, I pointed out rather smugly for a novice, that the Akashic records refer only to past events and actions, to former incarnations or lifetimes, and not to either the present or the future. He smiled again. But what earthlings call the past, present, and future are all one, you see, taking place simultaneously. By the way, the word simultaneously contains within it the letters of the words no time and time is a lie, which is what the word simultaneously really means. Think deeply about this. I did, very deeply, and it was at this instant that my enlightenment to lexigrams was born. He went on, his expression making it clear that he knew the seeds he had just planted with that word had taken root and would soon flower. In fact, he seemed to be positively elated. His face fairly beamed. I know it seems incomprehensible to you now, but after a while you will understand, And when you do, you will have mastered how to exist for temporary periods whenever you should wish in what is called the eternal now, a higher dimension of time. There are many such dimensions. Earthlings now exist in the third dimension and are ready to graduate into the fourth dimension. His words chimed a carol somewhere in the back of my mind. For some reason, I told him, what you just said about an eternal now reminded me of the lyric to a song about, on a clear day, you can see forever, my favorite tape cassette. I play it all the time. It's the recorded score from the stage musical and later film starring Barbra Streisand, written by Alan J. Lerner and Burton Lane, called On a Clear Day. For some strange reason, I always seem to miss seeing the film when it's playing in the theater near me, but I love the title song, especially the verse to it, before the chorus. Will you sing it for me? I would very much like to hear it. Shyly, softly, and unsure, I sang to him the words and melody as well as I could recall them. Spoken. Why, Daisy, you're a bloody miracle. Could anyone among us have an inkling or a clue what magic feats of wizardry and voodoo you can do? Sung. And who would ever guess the powers you possess, and who would not be stunned to see you prove there's more to us than surgeons can remove, so much more than we ever knew, so much more were we born to do. Should you draw back the curtain, of this I am certain, you'll be impressed with you. On a clear day, rise and look around you, and you'll see who you are. On a clear day, how it will astound you, when the glow of your being outshines every star. You'll feel part of every mountain, sea, and shore. You will hear from far and near a world you've never heard before. And on a clear day, on that clear day, you can see forever and ever more. I finished slightly off key. He clapped his hands like a small boy. That was beautiful. It describes so perfectly the powers possessed by all earthlings, each man and woman, yet they remain unaware of it. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat. Then, you have missed seeing the motion picture On a Clear Day for a reason you do not as yet suspect. I believe that you and your twin self will see it together, and that the seeing of this film together, the simultaneous sharing of its seedings about time and reincarnation, will be the first experience to open your third eyes, for it will contain certain subliminal messages for both of you. Yes, it is a clear day when one finally comprehends the mystery of making miracles. Thank you again for singing those words to me. I blushed. I'm sure I didn't sound like Barbra Streisand, I murmured, feeling a wave of embarrassment at having spontaneously burst into song before a stranger. But his next words erased those feelings. And why should you sound like her? Your earthling composer and musician, Paul Winter, who plays to the whales and dolphins in the ocean, and who has played duets with wolves and eagles in the woods in the key of earth, D-flat, causing them to respond and sing with him in perfect harmony, made a wise observation. It would be a sad and quiet, lonely forest if no bird sang except the nightingale. And so, once again, I thank you for singing to me. Thank you for your message, I replied. It's such a lovely event to anticipate, like a song in itself. Some familiar but forgotten melody I'm sure I'll hear in the back of my mind until the meeting with my twin self really happens. Yes, lovely. Oh, I just realized that lovely and lonely are very similar words, but with such different meanings. The lexigram seeds he had planted were already beginning to flower in my consciousness. As I spoke, I was thinking of my own loneliness, an affliction I'd begun to fear was to be permanent in my life. Yes, similar words, true, he agreed, with, as you say, quite different meanings. What makes them different is a third word hiding in one of them that answers all questions, solves all problems, heals all pain. What word is that? The lexigram blossoms were unfolding and fascinating me. He smiled. The word love. Notice that the word lovely contains the word love within it. The word lonely does not. He paused. All is love. I see, I told him. And for the moment I did. For a timeless time, then, we both remained silent. There was a humming stillness in the room that seemed to vibrate like some sort of energy force, the kind of stillness so tangible you can almost feel it, you know? I know this sounds contradictory, but the stillness grew louder until I became aware of a growing sense of uneasiness and apprehension. I looked at the clock. It was exactly 20 minutes past 1 p.m., 20 after. I remembered something my Irish elf grandmother, told me when I was a child. Something I'll share with you in chapter 3 of this book, and more of it in chapter 8. In the humming quiet between us, I was aware of the stranger still staring at me, unblinking, his eyes like burning coals. I finally found my voice and asked him hesitantly, just exactly when, in present time, am I supposed to be destined to meet this man who is my twin self? It is written that your reunion shall take place near Christmas in December of 1970, as time is calculated here on earth, at the end of this year. Reunion? I was confused. Since we'll be meeting each other, I assume for the first time, why do you call it a reunion? You will not be meeting for the first time. You have lived countless lives together in former incarnations, even in this present one. This was too much for me to untangle. But I persisted, if we have not yet met in this incarnation, which I'm absolutely certain we have not, then why do you say in this present one? It doesn't make sense. It's not logical. Is it some kind of a riddle? Yes, a riddle. One you may solve yourself, with his help, for you will teach each other many things. And now I really must leave you. He rose from his chair, causing me to feel a sharp stab of disappointment because I knew that this time he would really leave. Suddenly, the stab of disappointment was replaced by a surge of inexpressible happiness, enveloping me like a fine mist, and I felt so grateful to this kind stranger who had promised me such a perfectly marvelous Christmas gift as meeting my own twin self. Who hasn't secretly longed for such a miracle? He walked toward the door, and I followed. Then he stopped in front of a table at the entrance to the small hallway of the suite. On it was my miniature altar, consisting of an alabaster statue of St. Francis of Assisi, Francesco de Bernardone, with his beloved birds and animals, a bowl of fresh daisies, and several votive candles burning in ruby red glass holders, like the ones in St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue in New York City. I carry my small altar with me when I travel, using it to evoke minor magic and ordain baby miracles, for myself and others. It's rather like a portable cathedral. Of course, one doesn't really need such accoutrement to manifest magic or miracles. All one needs is a direct line of communication to one's higher self, or if you prefer, to one's own God, whoever he, she, or they may be. On the desert, in the woods, on a mountaintop, on the shore, or even walking along a crowded city street. But, speaking for myself, I feel the presence of angels with more certainty, and am able to spiral my thoughts more purely when my senses are thus sweetly incited by subtle ritual. My uninvited but most welcome visitor stood there before the flickering candles, very still, then in a low voice asked me to close my eyes while he offered a prayer. I did as he requested, bowing my head, and as I stood beside him in the scented dark, the musty mystical fragrance of my morning star church incense seemed richer than usual, and my thoughts drifted until I became aware that he had placed his hand gently on the top of my head, like a blessing, and then began to chant in a strangely familiar mystical language, similar to the Latin of the Mass, yet which was, I could tell, not Latin. The melodious sound of his chanting blended with the sweet scent of the incense in the black velvet behind my closed eyes, after a while transported me back into a magical childhood Christmas Eve, when I had slipped through the huge carved wooden doors of St. Raphael's convent to hear the nuns singing Silent Night, Holy Night in their soft voices a cappella. I could smell oranges and cinnamon in the air. Suddenly his chanting stopped, the light pressure of his hand on my head lifted, and I reluctantly returned from the past to the present, opening my eyes slowly, as if awakening from a dream. When I turned to say goodbye to my new friend, he was gone, simply disappeared. True, I had come out of my trance-like state and opened my eyes slowly enough for him to have had time to slip through the door. I mean, to have slipped out the door. Or would through it be more appropriate? But I had heard no sound of the door opening or closing. Shivering, I took the blue flowered comforter, folded across the bottom of the bed, sank down into the plump sofa chair by the window that looked out on the small white cross planted on the far hill behind Grauman's Chinese Theater across Hollywood Boulevard, tucked my feet under, and wrapped the comforter around me. It was a disturbing experience, but as I sat in the chair, snugly enfolded in the soft clouds of the comforter, an errant thought swam through the floods of school-teacher mother's voice, quoting from the New Testament. "Be not afraid, for thy comforter shall come." I smiled, then to myself at the incongruity of the play on words. Cosmic acuity aside, I was on the verge of believing it had all been a dream from the beginning, but there was the tape. And then I noticed on the glass-topped table beside the chair the small white card the stranger had handed me only seconds after I'd invited him to come into the room. I hadn't really looked at it before, assuming it was a business card. Now I saw that it was blank, except that printed in the center in a small violet letters were the words, "Expect a miracle." There was something else on the table beside the small white card I'd been given. The unopened box of Goober's peanuts, the kind sold in the lobby of every film theater in America. This the stranger had definitely not given me, and I knew I had not placed the box of chocolate-covered peanuts there myself. Where could they have come from, I wondered, unless the turbaned one had left them there when I wasn't looking? That must have been what happened, I told myself. There was no other explanation. But why would he have done so? The Goober's peanuts troubled me more than a little, because they were, in a complex way, associated with a traumatic relationship in my past. Back then, I had studied only the rudiments of basic numerology. I was later to be initiated into this art and science in more depth during my predicted retreat in the mountains. So I quickly scribbled down the numerical value of the letters in Goober and realized that the singular of the word must be spelled with 3 O's as goober. The plural had to spell with only 2 O's and a Z instead of an S, as in goobers. The proper numerological vibrations of the words make worlds of difference. Again, I reminded myself of my promise to the me of me that I would learn more, when I had time, about this deeply mystical and powerful code of the universe, taken from the Hebrew Kabbalah and steeped in the traditional wisdom of the ancient Chaldeans. For a long time I sat in the chair by the window, trying to memorize everything that had occurred during the stranger's visit so I wouldn't later forget anything important, even the slightest nuance of his words. Somewhere in my metaphysical studies in the past, I had heard of or read about those Rosicrucian adepti, called by many other names as well, who were able to disappear then reappear before one's physical vision by changing vibratory frequency of angstrom units per second, speeding up the rate to become invisible to the naked eye, and slowing down the rate to become physically visible. I had heard and read of such magic, but that never prepares one for the actual witnessing of it. I had not hallucinated. There was, you see, the box of Goober's peanuts and the small white card. If the stranger had not been real, but merely an ethereal vision I had invoked, then they could have appeared on the table only through what is called teleportation. And it was easier to accept that I had met an adept, after all, they most assuredly do exist, than to believe that I had apported the chocolate-covered peanuts and the card.